Morning. You guys are really dedicated. This paper is called Housing and Husbandry of Laboratory Animals, a Convergence of Ethics and Science. In most real-life situations, ethical imperatives compete with considerations of self-interest, usually to the detriment of ethics. For example, where ethical edicts dictate that we not lie, self-interest often pushes in the other direction. The cheating husband will lie through his teeth to escape detection by his wife, even while knowing at some level that cheating and lying are morally wrong. In the case of the treatment of animals used in research, a clear exception to this rule is manifest. The way we house and husband our laboratory animals is utterly removed from our desire to achieve realistic and accurate data. For example, when we fail to control pain or distress or stress that arises in research by virtue of how we manage or care for our laboratory animals, we are violating multiple moral requirements to minimize negative states in these animals, yet we're also violating multiple research imperatives requiring the obtaining of accurate physiological and metabolic data. Scientists who would never dream of dragging a relatively complex piece of equipment such as a microtome or an MRI to work behind their pickup truck on a rough road actually do far worse to the needs dictated by the natures or the word I use is telos, which has entered the vocabulary. Aristotle, see, huh?
Very back, we're having trouble hearing.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay.
Is that better in the back? You hear now?
I'm sorry, I have trouble being serious for longer than 5 minutes. Anyway, you would never drag a microtome to work behind your pickup truck on a dirt road, but you do the equivalent to the animals you use in your research. I experienced a remarkable and unforgettable example of this phenomenon in the early 80s when I was invited to deliver the banquet speech to an international meeting of the Shock Society. Guys know the Shock Society? It's a group of researchers, MD, PhD, and DVM, who study circulatory shock, i.e. circulatory collapse, which actually we're all going to die of as the proximal cause of our demise. The meeting was held in Jackson Lake Lodge, a very beautiful event. Any of you been there? Beautiful, up maybe 9 hours from here, near Jackson, Wyoming in the Grand Tetons. Like all federal resorts, the lodge was manned by college students and retirees. As soon as I entered, I was approached by a small group of young researchers who asked me to try and exert some influence on the leadership of the society because the society had promulgated an ironclad policy that any papers published in the journal could not report on any research where anesthesia was employed. No anesthetized animals. This despite the fact that shock research often reported on traumatic shock, circulatory collapse occasioned by trauma. Traumatic shock was created in many cases by insertion of the animal into something called a noble collop drum. I don't think they use that anymore, do they? Guys heard of it? Basically a dryer. And you'd insert the animal into the dryer. It rotated at 60 cycles a minute and created random trauma by bouncing the animals off of random protuberances. The use of analgesia or anesthesia was forbidden, using the excuse that the animals were mildly humans who, for example, were being traumatized in a car crash and thus were not anesthetized. In fact, a film of such a procedure using dogs was shown at the conference, with the projector being operated by a college student, one of the summer employees. At the close of the session, the student approached the president of the society, and this really freaked these people out, and remarked that, quote, "We all can't wait for you sons of bitches to be out of here." That was a men in the street kind of reaction, greatly upsetting members of society. Now, I was not as sweet, cuddly bear as I am now in those days. But that evening I gave my talk, and I began by sarcastically applauding the scientific spirit pervading shock research by virtue of not wanting to introduce such variables as anesthesia, that created disanalogies to real-life situations. You hear me okay? Sorry. All right. I continued by better? Okay. I continued by pointing out that the same scientific spirit doubtless led them to control for known variables that deform the shock response. Just that very year, I had pointed out, Gertner, you know Gertner? In Hanover, Germany? Had shown that one could take two standard group of lab rats, keep them under identical conditions for 6 months, the same, and then one day come in and move one cage 3 feet. Any of you know that data? By the time 100 seconds went by, numerous plasma variables indicative of a circulatory shock response would appear that persisted for 45 minutes. Surely, I said, you people control for these sorts of variables, or other known variables that are clearly impactful on animal physiology, such as the personality of the caretaker. Data had come out on that in the early 80s. All present indicated they never heard of these results. If that is the case, I said, how dare you withhold anesthesia, the provision of which is surely a moral presupposition of the kind of work you do. Furthermore, I argued, I will bet you that $200 currently in my wallet, I don't know why my wife let me take $200, but unless I was, I will bet you the $200 currently in my wallet against a Coke that we can create a function mapping the physiological responses of an anesthetized animal on an unanesthetized one. Right? Never before or since have I heard an audience that silent. The embarrassment finally ended when the president of the society, who was also the journal editor, cleared his throat and said, "I'm glad you brought that up. I was going to announce at the end of this session that our journal will no longer accept studies done on unanesthetized animals. That is a radical change." The audience spontaneously began to applaud, particularly the young people. They thought I did it, you know? I'm good, I'm not that good. This is a paradigmatic and dramatic example of both ignorance of and lack of attention to the needs and interests of laboratory animals. As I have extensively argued in great detail, and as the British journal Nature once remarked in the 60s, it was believed virtually universally that animal use in science is not a moral issue, it is a scientific necessity. Under the influence of a powerful ideology that pervaded science pretty much after Newton, science was seen as, quote, value-free in general and ethics-free in particular. This ideology I have termed the common sense of science, for it is to science what ordinary common sense is to daily life. The ideological insistence on experience as the bedrock for science continues from Newton until the 20th century, when it reaches its most philosophical articulation in the reductionistic movement known as logical positivism, a movement that was designed to excise the unverifiable from science, and in some of its forms, to systematize science in a formal way so that its logical derivation from observations is transparent. A classic and profound example of the purpose of the excisive dimension in positivism is found in Einstein's rejection of Newton's concepts of absolute space and time on the grounds that they cannot be tested. Other examples of positivist targets were Henri Bergson's and other biologists in the 19th century's talk of élan vital, life force, as being the essence of a living thing. You know, Francis Crick has a lot to say about that. I think it always sounds better in French. As what separates living from non-living. Or Hans Driesch, the embryologist's postulation of Aristotelian entelechies to explain regeneration in starfish. That means sort of active forces that are mysterious. Although logical positivism took many subtly different and variegated forms, the message as received by working scientists and passed on to students, including myself, was that proper science ought not allow unverifiable statements. Be that as it may, the positivist demand for empirical verification of all meaningful claims became a mainstay of scientific ideology from the time of Einstein till the present. Insofar as scientists thought at all in philosophical terms about what they were doing, they embraced the simple but to them satisfying positivism that I just described. Through that positivism, one could in good conscience dismiss religious claims, metaphysical claims, or other speculative assertions, not merely as false and irrelevant to science, but as meaningless. That was the dictum. Only what could in principle be verified or falsified was meaningful. In principle meant someday, given technological progress. Thus, although the statement there are intelligent inhabitants on Mars could not in fact be verified or falsified in 1940, it was still meaningful, since we could see how it could be verified by theoretically building rocket ships that would go to Mars, and then we would offer to play chess with them or whatever it would take to verify intelligence. Such a statement stands in sharp contradistinction to the statement there are intelligent beings in heaven, because however our technology is perfected, we don't even know what it would be like to visit heaven, because it is not a physical place. Okay? What does all this have to do with ethics? Quite a bit. The philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein, who greatly influenced the positivists, remarked in his seminal paper, Lecture on Ethics, that if you take an inventory of all the facts in the universe, you will not find it a fact that killing is wrong. That make sense? In other words, ethics is not part of the furniture of the scientific universe. You cannot, in principle, test the proposition that killing is wrong. It can neither be falsified nor verified. So in Wittgenstein's view, ethical judgments are empirically and scientifically meaningless. From this, it was concluded that ethics is outside of the scope of science, as in fact are all judgments regarding values rather than facts. The slogan I learned in the 60s when I was taking science classes, and that is still being taught in many places, is that science is value-free in general and ethics-free in particular. Okay? And you can see why this would be appealing, but unfortunately it doesn't work. The particular denial of the relevance of ethics to science was taught both implicitly and explicitly. One could find it explicitly stated in science textbooks. For example, while I was researching a book on animal pain in the late 80s, I looked at some basic biology texts, two of which my colleague and I actually used, ironically enough, in an honors biology course that we taught for 25 years in the attempt to sort of counter this positivism and introduce students to both the philosophical and ethical issues that science gave rise to. Gould and Keaton's widely used biology textbook, Biological Science, in what one of my colleagues calls the throat-clearing introduction, scientific method, Copernicus, Darwin, wherein the authors pay lip service to a few soft things and a little bit of history before getting down to the real stuff, the Krebs cycle, parts of a cell, etc. And in that book, the introduction declares that science cannot make value judgments or moral judgments. In the same vein, there was another book called Biology, Evolution, Diversity, and the Environment by Sylvia Mader, which affirmed that science does not make ethical or moral judgments. The Standard line at that time affirmed that science at most provides society with facts relevant to making moral decisions, but never itself makes such decisions. Okay? The logical positivism that informed scientific ideology's rejection of the legitimacy of ethics dismissed all moral discussion as empirically meaningless. That is not, however, the whole story. Positivists felt compelled to explain why intelligent people continued to make moral judgments and continued to argue about them. They explained the former by saying that when people make assertions such as killing is wrong, which seem to be statements about reality, they are in fact describing nothing. They are emoting or expressing their own revulsion at killing. Rather than describing a state of affairs, killing is wrong really expresses killing yuck. You see? Feh. And when people seem to debate about killing, we are not really arguing about ethics, which, after all, can't be done any more than you and I can debate about whether we like pepperoni or not. Rather, we are disputing each other's facts. So a debate about the alleged morality of capital punishment is my expressing revulsion at capital punishment while you express approval. And any debate we can engender centers on such factual questions as whether capital punishment indeed serves as a deterrent against murder, which is an empirical question. It is therefore not surprising, and some of the older people here will remember this, that when scientists were drawn into social discussions of ethical issues, they were every bit as emotional as their untutored opponents. Because their ideology dictates that these issues are nothing but emotional, the concept of rational ethics was seen as an oxymoron, and he who generates the most effective emotional response wins. So, for example, in the debate on the morality of animal research, which began in the 70s and persisted into the 80s, scientists either totally ignored the issue or countered criticisms with emotional appeals to the help of children. Do any of you remember the movie called Will I Be All Right, Doctor? You remember, Jeff? I wanted to show it to my science and ethics students, and so I called the neighbor and asked them if I could get a copy. They said, darn, they were all destroyed in a flood in our basement. If you believe that, I got a bridge to sell you in Brooklyn. The question is asked by a frightened child to a pediatrician before a surgery. And the answer given is, yes, you'll be all right if they leave us alone to do what we need with animals. So appallingly and unabashedly emotional and mawkish was the film that when it was premiered for a subsection of laboratory animal veterinarians and an ALAS meeting, a putatively sympathetic audience, the only comment came from a veterinarian from Duquesne who affirmed that, quote, he was ashamed to be associated with a film that is pitched lower than the worst anti-vivisectionist claptrap, which it indeed was. But that is not all. There was another major component of scientific ideology that harmonized perfectly with the value-free dictum. That was the positivistic behavioristic thesis that science could not legitimately talk about consciousness or subjective experiences, or even pain in animals, which led to a question about their existence. John Watson, the founder of behaviorism, has a great line somewhere where he comes very close to saying, we don't have thoughts, we only think we do. I wish I'd said that. The two mutually reinforcing components of scientific ideology taken together have caused incalculable damage to science, society, and objects of moral concern in science's failure to engage ethical issues and understand animal nature. This little anecdote is a corker. On one occasion, I was debating a pain researcher at a University of London conference. In the course of his talk, he vigorously denied that we could even know that animals feel pain, let alone what it was like. In my reply to him, I pointed out that he had been an esteemed pain researcher for over 30 years. And he said, "Thank you very much." If I'm not mistaken, I said, he did his work on dogs and extrapolated the results to people. He indicated that I was correct. "Well then," I affirmed, "either your speech today is false or your life's work is." And this shows how ideology can eclipse even logic, which is pretty sobering. We began by pointing out that self-interest and ethics are often antagonistic, but this is not the case with regard to the maintenance of laboratory animals. Modern post-Cartesian biology tends to see animals as machines. Indeed, the metaphysics, or way of looking at the world, which is another word for metaphysics, implicit in modern science, is mechanistic. It's amusing that the University of Colorado, at least a few years ago, had two biology departments. Did you guys know that? One was molecular biology, and the other one was organismic environmental biology. Guess which department got more money? For most contemporary biologists, we best understand living things when we understand them in terms of physics and chemistry. Traditional biologists, however, from Aristotle to Darwin, while certainly admitting that a mechanistic view was part of a complete explanation, opined that it was not the full story or even the main part of the story. Even more importantly, ordinary people do not focus on the mechanistic side of animals, but rather view animals in terms of their functions and powers. For Aristotle, as for ordinary common sense, animals as living things would eat, locomote, seek food, defend themselves, perceive, reproduce, all functions which different animals fulfilled in different ways. How they met all these goals is what made for the difference between species and constituted their nature, or telos. Interestingly enough, high school biology is still taught in that Aristotelian way. In the 20th century, it became expedient for agriculture, overwhelmingly the predominant social use of animals, to ignore animal nature beyond providing cheap food, water, and shelter, regardless of what the animal's nature dictated. Hence the feeding of bone meal to herbivores, which in turn introduced prion diseases into cattle. Similarly, with the advent of sow stalls, it is no surprise that such unnatural food and housing is in the process of being roundly rejected by the society, despite the fact that it produces cheap and plentiful food. In traditional agriculture, the person managing the animals placed them in the best possible environment congenial to their natures. For example, grazing animals were placed in lush forage. Thus, the shepherd or animal manager did his or her best to accommodate the needs and interests of the kind of animal in question. That was the ethic of good husbandry, so that the animal's telos was maximally accommodated and respected. And by the way, thence its welfare was. In other words, not only was the animal provided its natural diet of forage, it was allowed to deploy its natural powers for acquiring food by grazing. It was recognized universally that the farmer did well if and only if the animal did well, with doing well being equivalent to respecting the animal's nature. Not only was the animal provided with food, it was provided with the kind of food dictated by its nature, and the animal harvested it by grazing. Okay? With the rise of 20th century industrial confinement agriculture, titrating diet to animal nature was ignored. Simply providing nutrition sufficed, regardless of respecting animal powers evolved for eating. Cattle kept in feedlots and fed high-grain, high-concentrate diets provide a paradigmatic example whereby a significant percentage of the animals develop liver and ruminal abscesses. And you would think that would be prohibitive, but listen, although their natures are not respected and some animals get sick, the productivity of those who do does not outweigh the loss from the others. Similarly, with dairy cattle, these animals are naturally built to walk on pasture, but are kept primarily on concrete, leading to unnaturally high degrees of lameness and foot diseases. Temple Grandin estimates that certain parts of the country, up to 40% of a herd can be lame or have foot rot. And these, as you veterinarians know, are extremely painful. However, the milk production of the herd is unnaturally inflated, and thus productivity is severed from welfare. Exactly the same thing is true of laboratory animals. They are kept in accordance with human convenience, not out of respect for their biological nature or telos, which in many cases caretakers are not aware of. Cages are designed for ease of cleaning, not for fitting animal needs. I mean, there are exceptions to this, but overwhelmingly they're not. An excellent example is provided by rats and mice, who are by nature nocturnal burrowing creatures. Yet for human convenience, they were kept in 24 hours of light. So inimical was this to rat nature that they in fact experienced retinal deterioration, as some of you may know. Monkeys, which are highly social, were often kept in isolation in cages totally devoid of stimulation. Not only were animal natures not respected, they were not even known, and no attempts were made to accommodate them. So impoverished were environments for primates that it took 1986 federal law to demand housing for non-human primates that, quote, enhances their psychological well-being. Or in my language, would respect their biological and psychological natures. I toured the primate center at Davis in about 1980. Were any of you there? Well, the animals were singly caged in little cages, the baboons. And I said to the director, how can you do that? He said, oh, we have to. They're extremely mean. I said, did it ever occur to you that they're mean because you keep them singly caged? Because I had been to Australia, some of you may have as well, where there was a baboon colony where you could blow a whistle and they'd walk up to you outdoors for a blood draw. So clearly they weren't intrinsically mean. This sort of neglect was true for virtually every species used in research. Dogs were often caged singly with no attention paid to socialization. Have any of you seen that YouTube video about the beagles? You saw it? Yeah. It's worth seeing. It's really powerful. Cats, who are creatures that jump and climb, were not provided with perches for a long time. Whether in agriculture or in research, absolutely no attempts were made to respect animal nature, thereby implicitly putting their welfare in a highly compromised situation. In animals used in research, very little attention was paid to the stressfulness of environments, despite the patent truth that even tiny variations in environment wrought havoc with physiological and metabolic variables. Increase of cage size had been shown in the 70s to reduce toxicity of amphetamine by 50%. The LD50 for amphetamine in rats increased by 700%, when the rats were caged in groups of 12 compared to when they were caged singly. Virtually monthly examples are currently published illustrating the profound effect of housing conditions. For example, about a month ago, a study was released showing that the stress of rats is considerably elevated when animal caretakers are male rather than female. You guys see that? Well, we got these voices that I'm sure scare the hell out of a rat. Another study, according to a recent issue of The Scientist, demonstrated that stresses on pregnant rats can have measurable effects on granddaughters of those rats. Thousands of examples of these sorts of effects have been published since people began paying attention to housing, even showing a reduction in certain diseases when rabbits are socially housed. It is thus evident that ignoring animal telos in animal housing has profound effects on one's research results. Thus, the requirement of good science that dictates that attention be paid to animal nature, lest important variables relevant to the object of study be ignored or distorted. Remarkably, compliance with emerging social ethics for animals creates a demand for precisely the same attention to animal nature, not only in laboratories but in zoos as well. When I was a kid in Brooklyn, there was actually a giraffe in a cage. He was outdoors part of the time, but when he came indoors, the cage was too small for him to stand up. As we mentioned earlier, it is rare that the requirements of science and societal ethics converge. In order to minimize the stress that results from conflict between the requirements of research and an animal's needs and natures, we should come as close as possible for creating conditions that meet the dictates of their telos. Happily, the very same requirement is ever increasingly being dictated by the advancements in moral obligations for animals that are being expressed in societal ethics. Significantly, in 2004, how many pieces of legislation do you guys think were promulgated across the United States pertaining to animal welfare in 2004? I only know this because a veterinarian friend of mine tracks it. 2,400. Isn't that amazing? And many of them were devoted to making sure that various sorts of conditions accommodate the animal's natures. And interestingly enough, in Great Britain, respect for animal welfare numbers among the top 10 social issues recognized by the citizenry. It's number 8. During the 70s and 80s, when my colleagues at CSU and I were drafting what became the 1985 federal legislation protecting laboratory animals, it was essential to us to mandate control of pain in laboratory animals. This is amazing. Henry Waxman asked me to prove that there was no pain control used in science. Now, I had anecdotal evidence for this from technicians and students who'd call me and say, we're doing burn research, we're doing fracture research, and we don't even give the animals an aspirin. But I had to prove it. So how do you prove it? I had a friend who was a librarian at your library, and I asked him, could you do a literature search for analgesia for laboratory animals? Okay? How many papers do you think he found? 10,000? One of which said there ought to be papers. That was my favorite, actually. And the second one said, we don't know much, and here's what we know. And it was 1/4 of a column in JAVMA. See? Those of you who are old, any old veterinarians in here? You're not old enough. When did you graduate?
1978.
Maybe you're old enough.
Yeah, they weren't giving analgesics for doing basic meters at that time. That was standard practice.
CSU didn't do it until the 90s, when Temple Grandin had a hysterectomy, and she went into the hospital and said, what kind of pain relief are you giving? For what? For spays. We don't consider it necessary. What? You guys have heard Temple. I thought she was going to attack them. But in any case, it got quickly changed. And more to the point, we were also aware that pain control was not the only consideration for assuring laboratory animal welfare. We also asked that housing and husbandry be altered to accommodate the animals' telos. Of course, you all know Congress responded by mandating only exercise for dogs and environments for primates that enhance their psychological well-being. Any of you remember Dr. Rissler at APHIS? He was briefly in charge of writing regulations, and he told me a great story. He said, I don't know what psychological well-being of primates is. I don't even know what primates is because I'm a vet, and that's not one of our species. So I went to the American Psychological Association, and I asked them, what's psychological well-being? And they said, don't worry, Dr. Rissler, there's no such thing. And he said, well, there will be after January 1st, '87, whether you guys help me or not. Good answer. Although historically there has always been a societal ethic for animal treatment, it was extremely minimalistic, forbidding intentional, willful, deliberate, purposeful, sadistic infliction of pain and suffering on animals. Clearly, such an ethic is seriously defective. If all of the suffering that animals experience at human hands is examined, how much do you think results from deliberate cruelty? A lot or a little? Tiny, tiny amount. Most animal suffering results from perfectly reasonable human motives, such as making more money or meeting human needs, etc. Nothing done for the general benefit of society is actionable according to the anti-cruelty laws. That's a blanket omission. These laws exist to punish sadists and psychopaths, so when society wishes to regulate or curtail normal or non-deviant uses of animals, a new ethic underlying such legislation is required. Plato taught that all ethics comes from previously existing ethics, so that when society attempts to create a new ethic for animals, it looks to our previously extant ethic for human beings. If animals are to be considered objects of moral concern, the same notions we deploy in moral consideration of humans should be applied, mutatis mutandis, to animals. And pivotal to our ethic for humans is the protection of human individuals and their natures from encroachment and transgression for the sake of the general good. The fences that we build around human individuals to protect them from excessive zeal on behalf of the general welfare, such as using them as involuntary subjects in majorly invasive experiments, are called rights and are based on a plausible theory of human nature. Humans are beings who by nature wish to hold on to their property, express themselves freely, avoid being hurt, believe or not believe as they see fit, and all of the other demands encoded in the Bill of Rights, which is essentially a theory of human nature. As we have argued throughout our discussion, animals too have natures, or teloi. There is, as Michael Fox once put it, a pigness to a pig, a dogness to a dog. And one of the really terrible things about sow stalls is they don't acknowledge the pigness of the pig. In nature, a sow will cover 1 mile a day in foraging, and she can be enclosed for 5 years in a 2-foot by 3-foot by 6-foot box. It is far too simple, as utilitarians like Singer do, to base our moral obligations to animals on their ability to feel pain and pleasure. When a coyote caught in a trap chews its leg off to escape, it's clear evidence that freedom from captivity is more important to it than pain. Did you guys know that? Coyotes will do that, beavers will do it, etc. It's showing us that freedom from captivity is more important to it than pain. It is impossible to reduce all the harmful things we do to animals simply to pain. Removing a calf from a milk cow prematurely causes great distress to both cow and calf, with both animals bawling piteously. Have any of you heard that? Terrible. You never forget it, right? For weeks. Yet we wouldn't call that pain in a utilitarian sense. Similarly, of course, with grief. Similarly with fear. As with humans, we must base the rights of animals not simply on pain, but upon violation of their nature. And that in turn allows us to create a Bill of Rights for animals based on their biological and psychological needs and natures. I addressed in 1979 all the Canadian government ministers that worked with animals, the ministers of fisheries and ag and all that. And we had a whole day seminar. When I was finished, they said, well, obviously we need a Bill of Rights for animals. And I said, yeah, I never thought of that. That's really brilliant, actually. 6 months later, somebody sent me a copy of a memo from the Minister of Fisheries and Oceans, who had been asked by the Vancouver Aquarium to take some more killer whales from Canadian waters to replenish their stock. And he wrote, not till you can demonstrate that you can accommodate their natures. Actually, he said telos, so it was pretty nice. Clearly, we thus come to know animal nature by close interaction with them and careful attention to what matters most to them. To restrict a lion to a small cage cannot reasonably be called pain, but certainly violates the animal's need, and if you agree with me, concomitant right to be housed in a manner as close as possible to what it encounters in nature. It is thinking in these terms that helps us to comprehend the sense in which animals should be afforded rights. And you know, those people who lampoon that by saying right to vote and all that kind of thing, it's just stupid. Generally, it is impossible to provide a captive lion in a zoo or one used for research with space commensurate with that of its hunting range. But that is not to say that we must be content with keeping the animal in a small cage. That's a kind of standard reasoning that I've heard. Well, we can't give them a 100-mile range, so we might as well put them in 10 feet. Similarly, just because we cannot create a fully natural environment for baboons or chimps does not mean that we can neglect the considerations implicit in a better environment dictated by these animals' natures. Does that make sense? Thus, we can see how the needs of research and the ethical requirements for the animal converge around the concept of telos. And just because our formulation of biological science tends to be mechanistic and reductionistic does not mean that our common sense and naturalistic understanding of animal nature needs to be mechanistic and reductionistic. The concept of telos is both implicit and explicit in common sense and common experience, and indeed implicitly figures in our understanding of the animals with whom we interact and whose lives are by default in our hands. I had an interaction with Smithfield. You know who Smithfield is, the big pork producer, in 2008? I was doing some consulting for Chipotle, and they asked me to come and meet them in Vail. So I met them, we had dinner, and they attended my talk, and then we had 4 more hours. And they asked me what would I change if I were them, and I said I'd change south stalls. And they said, why? It's convenient, it's productive, blah, blah, blah. I said, I'll tell you what, go out in the street, go in the supermarkets, and talk to your customers, show them pictures. They said, what are we going to find? I said, well, emphatically, don't believe me, go out and do it. But you will find, by my reckoning, 75% of the public rejects those explicitly. They called me 6 months later and said, actually, it's 78%. I stand corrected. And they said, and we are going to abolish these. 2 springs ago, they let 200,000 sows into group housing, you know? And as I remarked in Italy, maybe that'll keep me out of hell. By the way, do you know how many papers there are on pain control now? You're exactly right, Jeff. 12,000 the last time I looked. Maybe that'll keep me out of hell. On the other hand, eating bacon on Yom Kippur counts against me. So we must look to ordinary common sense to help us see what our obligations to animals are, and when we have transgressed for the sake of profit or convenience beyond the boundaries of decency. It must be recalled, actually that's one point that I agree with Neighbor about, the vast majority of laboratory animals do not experience physical pain, but all suffer from violation of their natures. It is gratifying to report that the latest edition of the NIH guide has to some extent caught up with societal ethics by requiring that social animals be housed with others of their own kind according to their natures, except in exceptional mitigating circumstances, such as alternative requirements dictated by a particular research problem. This is an excellent beginning, but of course nowhere near fully articulating the requirement that we respect animal nature. And I'll bet the farm that 95% of you agree with that. To make animal research, I wrote a paper recently called Making Animal Research a Moral Science, the 18th century called a moral science. We must not only control animal pain, but we must also see to it that as far as possible, all other needs and interests generated by the animal telos be respected. As we have stressed throughout this discussion, this is both a moral and a scientific requirement and must be respected if science is to remain in accord with the demands of social ethics, which it must do to be supported. Thank you for listening so early.